Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, to the presentation of the 2017 results. For those of us watching us online, we are meeting as usual in Mysza, in our domicile in Mysza in Warsaw. With us are all the analysts and those online. Traditionally, with us are Mr. Baranowski and Mr. Emil Baranowski, CFO. My name is Kuba. I'm the investor relationship head. We will be discussing the events for last year and with a brief forecast as for the future. Exceptionally, then Mr. Wojtowicz will discuss finance, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. We've provided the first opportunity to ask them to those in the room and those watching us during the streaming. There's a chat box, or you can direct the questions directly to my email. Thank you very much, and over to Mr. President. Thank you very much. A hearty welcome, everyone, all those gathered both in this room as well as those watching us online. I'm sorry about my voice, but unfortunately, these are things which cannot be foreseen or avoided, especially at this time of the year. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to inform you, all of you, that next year in a row PGE can sport. For the next year in a row, PGE can sport good results. The EBITDA result has amounted to 7.6 billion zlotys, which represents 4% more than in 2016. It was even higher if we don't take into account the assumed EDF assets. On a cash basis, we have generated over 8 billion zlotys, which allowed us to fund our investments with a vengeance, without taking into account the capex on the acquired assets. The adjusted net result was at last year's level, and it amounted to 3.4 billion zlotys. The good financial result can be attributed to the solid operating group work of the entire group. We have generated near on 57 terawatt-hours of electricity and over 25 million gigajoules of heat. We delivered 3% more electricity, over 35 terawatt-hours, and we sold our customers over 40 terawatt-hours. We have had significant progress in the strategy of the group. The most important event of last year was the acquisition of the district heating assets, which will be the core of the heating strategy. A palpable effect of this was the launching of the gas and steam fired unit in the Gorzów power plant. The greatest important is attached to our key investments. We're looking into the progress in Opole to make sure that they meet all the reliability and safety requirements. I would rather for the schedule not to undergo any changes. I wish to emphasize that we are overseeing the contractor to meet the requirements. In 2017, we also started the project to adjust our requirements, the adjustment of our assets to the BAT requirements. We also initiated PGE Ventures by starting our cooperation with innovative investments. The good results for last year give every reason to be happy. By heading the board, I try to look ahead beyond the horizon of the next few months. Our utmost goal is to ensure a good long-term position, market position for the entire PGE group. Any changes to the regulatory environments tilt us towards the low-emission scenario in our plans. This is the most probable direction of the company's development post-2020. However, the preparations for the two other options have been suspended. Our analyses indicate that it's also possible to base generation based on gas in the existing locations. I'm first of all talking about Dolna Odra. We can optimistically consider the commissioning of 2 units, gas-fired units of 500 megawatts each in Dolna Odra. The results of the feasibility study should be available in the middle of this year. We're also analyzing the possible investments in another gas-fired unit of 500 megawatts. It is key for analysis to look into the shape of the power market. Of course, great significance is attached to the changing requirements of the climate policy of the EU. On the other hand, the other technologies will complement our generating capacities. The marine wind farm are considered to a strategic development option. As of today, we have concluded an agreement with PSC. We're looking into the environmental studies and wind capacity. However, the development in marine wind farms is so far that you cannot envisage building wind farms without a relatively low support level. We are also optimistically looking at the funding sources, so there's a lot of interest in such projects. It's not without significance that low emissions technologies will be supportable from compensation mechanisms foreseen for Poland in ETS directive. It's a little bit too early to talk about the detailed schedule, but the plan to carry out 1,000 megawatts in the middle of next decade is feasible and realistic. And cogeneration based on low emission fuels, because these are exactly our plans in our heat generation, is another step towards the diversification of generation sources in PGE. We are certain that it will also additionally impact the quality, improve the quality of the air in those locations where PGE is operating. Changes to the regulatory environment and our response to this changing environment will have an impact on our business model, and I'm convinced that it will be a positive impact. Right now, after the takeover of the cogeneration EDF assets, the share of the regulated assets in the entire structure will be growing. The foreseeability of the financial result is especially important due to the challenges I mentioned before. Our investment plans will also generate additional cash streams, and also it's very important for the functioning units and the delivery of power. We'll have the power exchange. And information on our strategic investments will be started by the projects in Opole and Turów. And let me tell you a couple of words about the adjustment of our assets to the BAT conclusions. The advancements of the Opole projects as of today represents roughly 90%. The capex incurred last year attained to a level of 1.8 billion zlotys. As you will know, the general contractor presented the new dates of the commissioning of units 5 and 6. Consequently, we have also some shifts to the financial schedule. Due to the complex nature of the projects, and the delays. We're still in the process of negotiations with the general contractor and designer. Negotiations have not been finished yet. The works are underway. With regard to unit number 5, the so-called cold run has been started. With regard to unit number 5, among others, installation works on the boiler are underway. The emission graphs accompanying us always as we discuss this investment, it's worth paying attention to the huge emission difference for the new units and those existing ones which we have on PGE as of today. Now, a couple of words about Turów, where the project is in the middle of the construction work. In Q4 2018, the turbo unit assembly was started on the site. Some additional installations are being installed, such as the desulfurization installation along with the gypsum warehouse. The capex for this year represents roughly 1 billion zlotys. It should be commissioned in the first half of 2020. We can see the environmental impact of these investments. The CO2 emissions are 25% lower than in the operational units in Turów as of today. As for the adjustment of our generation assets for the BAT conclusions, are deemed to be a necessity. The BAT conclusions are a restriction with regard to the IAD. The generation assets have to be adjusted to the new requirements by the end of 2011. Over less than 5 years for the adjustments to the BAT conclusions is considered by us as relatively short. It takes time to adjust it to the public procurement law. Let me assure you that the process is under control, and I see no threats for its attainment. The preparation process for this investment was started in 2017 with the first tender proceedings, the first decisions, and administrative permits. The analyses encompassing conventional energy are almost concluded. We know the scope of the investments, the preliminary schedules, and the planned capex. We're also getting close to the conclusion of the analyses in the newly acquired assets. We assume that as for the capex that we will have to incur for the entire project, both for the power plants as well as heat and power plants for PGE, with the new assets will amount to 1.9 billion zlotys. This amount will make it possible for us to maintain the production capacities, and in the case of heat and power plants, will additionally ensure the deliveries of heat for the local communities. Part of the projects are underway. We're continuing the works in heat and power plant Bydgoszcz, Pomorzany, and the power plant of Turów. While modernizing units 1, 2, 3, we are doing some works connected with BAT conclusions. The preparatory works for the adjustment for Bełchatów and Opole are underway. Here we're testing various variants, and we're the closest to making the investment decisions. And now over to Mr. Wojtowicz, who will guide you through the operating and financial results of our group. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All the interesting things have been mentioned by Mr. Baranowski. The less interesting have been left to me, but we'll try to wade through them. Last year represented an increase of energy in the country, which followed consistently the GDP growth. This growth was of 2%, but since the imports were higher than exports, the generation was lower than the usage, and it also grew less by 2% only. As we take a look at Q4 only in 2017, the imports were higher than the exports, and in 2017, last year, the situation was converse. This will be visible in the next slides. The effect of it will be visible in the next slides about our generation. The situation was that Poland was a net importer, and the situation started roughly around March 2017. As we take a look at the prices, we can see a significant increase in Q4, roughly around September, October. This translated into the increase in the average forward price for 2018. When we last saw each other in November, the average price of the base for 2018 was of roughly 165 zlotys. For the entire year, this average grew by 3 zlotys to 168 zlotys. Two obvious factors was the CO2 price increase and the permits prices also started growing in Q4, and the materialization, as well as the materialization of the coal price increases. As we look at the quotes in 2018, for 2019, as of today, the base price is close to 180 zlotys. As we take a look at the volumes, so first of all, in those volumes, you can already see an effect of the takeover of Rybnik and the heat generation assets from the from mid-November. Rybnik, that's where you can see the hard coal bar. The increase by the acquisition of Rybnik represent 1.4 terawatt hours. The heat generation assets based on natural gas was another 0.25 terawatt hours. As we look at the entire year, our production grew by 3 terawatt hours, and one of the effects that I mentioned was the acquisition of the assets, and another important one was the lignite-based generation, which was higher by 1.6 terawatt hours, roughly. This generation, which was higher over the year, largely resulted from the base, because in 2016 we had overhauls in Bełchatów, which represented a much higher scale and lower number of hours last year, and the effect was slightly lowered by the overhauls in Turów. So we try to make sure that our repair and overhaul plan should mean that we are capable of delivering energy from the highest margin assets in a stable way. As we take a look at Q4 only, we can see the entire effect of asset acquisition that we can see in Q4. This is one of the effects which impacted the generation increase. Another element which should be mentioned was the decrease in lignite-based generation, and it results from two reasons. The first one were the overhauls of unit number 14 in Bełchatów was precisely finished in Q4. and the overhauls in Turów. Unit 2 was also finished in Q4. The impact of those overhauls should be estimated at roughly two-thirds of the difference, two-thirds of the 9% of decrease, and also we had a lower load of our lignite-based generation, which resulted from two factors. Firstly, because Poland became a net importer, and the fact that Q4 was quite rich in winds, which we will subsequently see in the operating ratios. Passing on to the typically financial data, the entire year can be deemed to be successful. The key financial data of the P&L indicate a stable increase by several percent, just as our Polish economy is growing. We're growing along with it. In Q4, we can see certain events that impacted the decrease in the result as compared to Q4 2016. One of them has already been mentioned. That was the lower generation based on lignite, which is the highest in terms of margin. Another important element is again the fact that in the base year 2016, in Q4, we had calculated the landslide compensation in Turów. That was 5 million zlotys. We didn't have such an impact this year. As for the elements that had a positive impact on our EBITDA, was the acquisition of the assets. That's roughly 190 million in terms of the stable EBITDA. The decreases at the EBIT levels and net result resulted from the write-offs to non-current assets, which we informed you about in January, roughly 800 million in conventional generation, over 100 million in renewables, so roughly it's about 1 billion zlotys. As we take at the indebtedness ratio, because it's getting close to 1.0, debt to EBITDA. This was largely attributed to the settlement of the LTCs and an impact of roughly 1 million zlotys in Q4 in terms of the revenues in Q3. As we take a look at what impacted this result, there were a couple of important ratios. One of them is the lower energy price, electricity price achieved, largely mitigated by the higher volume. And also, what's important for us is that it was a higher volume based on lignite. As we take a look at the fuel prices, fuel costs, then the lower costs of biomass cost of coal was at a similar level. However, there was a smaller volume at a higher price, slightly higher price. Natural gas was a higher price due to the work in heat and power plant in Gorzów. Other elements was the increase in the margin. In the trade sector, which we talk about each quarter, the trade policy focused on margin rather than the volume, which yielded roughly 153 million of a higher EBITDA result. The renewable support effect meant roughly 82 million more than in 2016, and that was a combination of two effects. The lower costs of green certificate amortization, and however they have a negative effect in renewable as well as conventional generation. Distribution contributed an increase by 150 million in EBITDA, mostly due to the higher volume, which I will mention in just a moment. Throughout 2017, we recognized 81 million zlotys worth capitalized costs, and that's what I mentioned, the acquisition of the Rybnik assets yielded 193 million in increased EBITDA from mid-November. As we take a look at operating data for the core generation assets, you can see what we have already mentioned. The higher availability of power for lignite throughout the year translated into a better utilization of them, whereas in Q4 there was a better usage of hard coal-fired power plants. Those were the most important operating changes. As we take a look at wind-based assets, which I mentioned in Q4, we had better wind conditions, a better utilization of wind farms, even given slightly lower availability. In terms of the distribution, as I mentioned, it contributed 150 million more in terms of the EBITDA, mostly as a result of the increased volume which our distribution distributes, and this is visible. You can see a stable increase, much higher than the electricity consumption in our national system, which means that Eastern and Central Poland is growing faster than the average for the entire country. We're lowering the grid losses. You can also see a stable enhancement of the results. We estimate that the lowering of the grid losses has allowed us to avoid, for the country, to avoid an emission of CO2 at the level of 1.5 million tons over the last 6 years, which is also a thing that we wish to remember, that it's not only the emissions of our power plants that are getting improved, but we are also working on this indirectly through distribution. In terms of the things that we succeeded at, was also a lower connection times, and among the things we also succeeded at was the lower SAIDI and SAIFI for planned works. What we failed at, because this was beyond our control, were the weather conditions. Here, obviously, both SAIDI and SAIFI ratios for 2017 exceeded the ratios which were superimposed on us by the ERO. The increases were quite significant in terms of the variations. I'm not sure if the expression "fortunately" is the right one, but it's true that it's not a phenomenon that only affected PGE distribution. That was the case in the case of all the 4 large distributors. The winds or snowfall or other weather phenomena meant that each of them exceeded the ratios imposed by ERO, and as the whole sector, we're in the process of dialogue with ERO about how such phenomena, extraordinary phenomena, should be treated. As for the slide on CapEx, they amounted to almost 7 billion zlotys, most of which for the construction of the Opole power plant, and this investment also triggered the largest variance, because that was largely by 30%, almost by 30% of our annual CapEx. Naturally, the reasons were the lower expenditure in Opole are very well known. The works have not been commissioned, so we're not paying for them. We're in the process of the negotiations with the general contractor and the general designer. As for other major areas where we're investing, that's distribution, that's 1.7 billion. That's a stable level. We're connecting new recipients, overhauling and modernizing our grid in terms of the medium and low voltage. In terms of renewable energies, capital expenditures were not that high. It was rather about the asset maintenance. As we pass on to what's probably of most interest to you as we can about how we perceive this year, the current year. The first thing, there's a new verse, a new line, which is called new assets. And as of Monday, the next Monday, we will be working on making sure that this line should soon be called the heat generation or district heating segment. We would like to report this sort of energy generation and the district heating as a separate segment. As we take a look at district heating, we expect here a decrease which will be triggered by the tariff mechanism, that the costs are transferred with a 2 years delay, so an increase in coal prices will not be visible right off in the tariffs for this year. This largely triggers the expected decrease in this segment. In conventional generation, there are no major unexpected changes. As compared to our expectations from November, after the 3 quarters, now we expect a higher sales price. Q4 of 2017 was the period when the forward prices increased. Hence, we expect higher sales prices. We also expect higher volumes owing to the decreasing of the overhauls. So what we expected to be lower this year by a whole terawatt-hour, now we believe it's only going to be a decrease in Bełchatów by 0.5 terawatt-hours. Of course, here a word of caution. We will see how the situation will be developing in the entire sector, in the entire energy system, how much import there's going to be and how much, what the wind conditions will be. You have to remember that last year the imports prevailed starting from March, so it will probably not be significantly higher than it was in 2017. We can also observe an increase in the price for CO2 emissions, emission permits. The question is how it will translate into the spot energy prices. What we already know is that the lower volume of free CO2 emissions, this is something we have to take into account each year. These are the main factors that will impact the expected decrease in the conventional generation EBITDA. In terms of renewables, Q4 was a very good quarter. We had a very good We had very good wind conditions. We're expecting average wind conditions, so the generation results might be worse, which we hope to be mitigated by the decrease in the real estate tax due to the new legislation. In terms of the supply segment, there was going to be a decline, however, from a very high base. We can hardly expect such high margins which we had owing to the lower the changes in the green certificates market. In terms of distribution, we're talking about a moderate growth, volumes, higher RAB, and a better return on assets. When it comes to the question whether the failure of meeting the qualitative ratios would have an impact for this year, not yet. If ERO decides to use their prerogatives, it will only take place it will only be visible in the tariffs for 2019. Our expectations regarding the capex, that's an increase of 20% vis-à-vis our execution for 2017. Of course, a large impact can be attributed to the progress of the works in Opole. Also, we're talking about a large impact about the conclusion of the tenders for the modernization of our assets due to BATs. In those places where the capex is stable in terms of distribution, we also expect similar capex levels of roughly 1.7 billion or 1.8 billion, depending on the weather conditions of how long we will be able to perform those works during the year. And this is essentially all as regards the comments. Now I think it's the time for the questions. Now, thank you very much for the presentations. I'd like to give the floor over to the guests gathered in the room. Well, unfortunately, mostly gentlemen, because ladies somehow failed to join us. So, over to Piotr. Good morning, Piotr Dzięciołowski, Citibank. I would like to ask, maybe that's a technical question, but you wrote that these are net, this is a net expenditure for Opole of 11 billion zlotys. This is slide 6, and I'd like to verify whether it's gross or net, because historically we'd like to think that 11 that's gross and 9 is net. So that's my first question. Well, here we're talking about the contract value of 9.4 with the general contractor, and 11 billion. This is the gross amount. If we add VAT, that's the result. But these amounts don't include the preparatory capex, like for instance carbonization carbonization, so everything which is not done by the general contractor. Well, it seemed to me that if I've lived with Opole investments for 4 years, I knew how much it works. So what is the additional capex on carbonization and all the additional work? So how much is it going to work all in all? How much is it going to cost all in all? Maybe later. This is. We're going to cope with this.
VAT się zmieniał w międzyczasie.
VAT has changed. Okay, now I'd like to ask about the realized electricity price, because yours was 180. When are we going to see the current prices in PLN? And should you assume some shape on top of the baseline? Because you're not selling this, you're largely selling on the peak. It's not a 50-50 proportion. So when would you see that we should assume it? And am I right in claiming that it might generate another 500 million if we take the mark-to-market in terms of your generation of? I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. The first question was when we will be able to see the price increase on our P&L. Partially, it's going to be this year in the part which regards the spots. Of course, I'm not going to tell you how much more energy we still have to sell. And as for the increase in the forwards from 168 to 179, the 179 regards the deliveries, the supplies in for 2019. Of course, we're talking about the impact on the revenue side, because there's still the impact on the cost side. This increase did not come from nowhere. Of course, for the consumers, this is an increase by about 10 zlotys, but on the cost side, we're talking about an increase in CO2, and per my quick calculations, it turns out that whereas the average price purchased last year was 20 plus zlotys, from January to date, the increase from 5-6 euro to a maximum of even 10 euro would cause an increase in the CO2 costs to as many as 40 zlotys. So it's also going to be visible next year. Let me make it more precise. Do you see any connection between the increase in the coal prices and the result reported by PGE in the generation segment? And what will be the impact of the increase from 10 to 12 per gigajoule. It will depend on how much we will be able to generate based on lignite, because indeed the impact of the hard coal price is the largest, because in our two compounds we have some fixed costs to a large extent. So an increase in the hard coal prices, if it triggers any increase in the energy market price, it will have an advantageous impact. Whether it is the price you mentioned, 500 million or 500 million, I cannot confirm it right off. I have another question for Mr. Baranowski, because you said that you could support those results that are historically high. How will you connect those historically high results in the P&L to the stock quotes? Because today it has the historical lows. Why is it so much divergent from the historically good results? Well, is it troubling you? Have you tried supporting the stock quotings and the investors? Of course, it is worrying us. Because as we've always repeated, other than the financial results of the company, we're interested in the fate, or shall I say, the profits generated by the investors on PGE stocks. Why it is the case that right now we have the record-breaking lows in the entire energy sector? It's not only the issue of PGE, it's rather a problem of all the power generators. It's actually you, gentlemen, that you should answer this question. We know that, but we wanted to hear what you have. So let me allow other colleagues to ask the questions. Before we give the floor over to you, we have a live question from one of the web users. The question, to make it more precise, in terms of our strategic investments, is our browser right in understanding that they have been suspended? Because you said they were not. No, I think I never said any of these strategic options that we've shown in the strategy for 2016 to be suspended. All the works in line with the updated schedules for 2016 are still underway. And what I said and what I wanted to emphasize is the fact of the low emissions energy generation, and we're certain, based on what's going on in Europe and what a great pressure is put on climate-related issue, whether it relates to ETS or the winter package, that a stronger entry into this sector will be beneficial to the company in the midterm. I'm not sure if I've answered this question. I think you've made it much more precise than the question expected. Grzegorz. Grzegorz Witkowski. I wanted to ask you about PGE heat energy. I think that is the price Energetyczna. We've seen 700 million after the third quarters. Now we've seen the contribution for half of a quarter of 200 million. So I'm just trying to do quick math in my head, and the result I'm arriving at is 1.2 billion. If if the first half of Q4 was just as good as the second half, is this the annual result, 1.2 billion? And the next question I would ask, what will be the result for 2018? You conservatively planned for this to be lower, which is understandable given the coal price increases and their translation into the tariff. Well, okay, so I understand this is highly seasonal, hence the math is not that simple, but Q1 and Q4 tend to be highly profitable. Q2 is usually breaks even, and Q3 usually incurs losses. So the question is, what would be the result and the delta? Because we've seen part of the result in 2017 already. I would only comment on this in such a way that we don't provide any hard data either for the company or for the segment, but it seems that you need to take into account the seasonality. So it's not going to be 6 times the amount as the base. You need to subtract a little bit from the base due to the mechanism. I mean, the prices of coal will not be translated into the tariff so quickly. So I will skip the quantification. Paradoxically, 1.5 months is quite much because that's the best 1.5 months. Yes, it's among the best periods. We've already had another such a good period this year, 2018, yes. And since February was a cold month, you will probably be able to tell a little bit. Well, we never provide any hard forecasts, so... But as for the base, can you relate to the history? Was it 1.2 billion or was it less? It was less. But we've had we had the 7 weeks for Q4. It's not ours, so we provide. We're not commenting on this, so we're just providing what relates to us. So it's roughly this. There's also a rule of thumb, which is around the building of the expectations for 2018, which is that the EDF will mitigate the gap derived from LTCs. It might be difficult. Well, that would be the indication. If we multiply 6 times 200, and since it's too optimistic, you have to subtract a little bit. Well, it seems you're right. Since I'm holding the mic, I would ask about the nuclear power plant. For the past few months, we've heard mostly from the governmental circles that we would hear some specifics, and we still don't know anything. You seem to be a natural challenger to deal with this, and by the way, you are the largest shareholder of the company that has dealt with this so far. Could you tell us a little bit when we could expect any major specifics regarding this? Depending on what sort of specifics you mean. Whatever we know. Well, you will remember that in September 2016 we announced or modified our strategy and concluded that we had several strategic options. As of today, each of those strategic options is being pursued by us, developed. We've assumed new working schedules. The schedules have been prepared in such a way that the projects would be as efficient as possible. As regards the scope of the works, as of today, as part of PGE J1, we're involved in the environmental impact and location works and preparing the environmental impact report as well as the location report. Once those basic things have been developed and concluded, we will be making a decision as for the future. The schedule expected of those works assumes that it should be concluded by the turn of next year. So what would be the decision at the end of the year? We will have the report in hand and we will be making a decision then. Besides, the decision is not only dependent on the results of our work and analyses, but also on the entire macroeconomic environment, which, as you will know, changes quite significantly. And considering all this, we will be able to make an ultimate and rational decision on the scope, shape, and size of the project. Robert Mike, Popema. Do you think the atomic project will be able to take part in the power exchange? And I think the time scope of a nuclear power plant being built is so remote that probably it will not take part in the first auctions of the power exchange. So you will be calculating this without the power exchange. That's right. Since we're talking about the capex, how would you summarize the new gas-fired units and offshore? Because how much is it going to cost because of offshore? Let's start with the offshore. Indeed, we're all observing a very large technological advancement in terms of offshore, and also observing and hope for this to be much more visible, the lowering of the cost of such a project. On the one hand, the power increases, the technology changes. What we are based on at the moment as regards the costs of such a project, we're talking about roughly 12 to 14 million zlotys, and a third of this are the costs of a connection. Depending on how of what our negotiations will be with regard to the connection costs, it will either charge the project or not. As regards the gas-fired projects, how much is a unit, roughly? We assume that the cost of a gas unit is of 850 million euro per megawatt. One question as regards CO2. Do you have any explanation for the dynamic increase from the beginning of the year by €2? And another question about cogeneration and the planned dividends. Do you plan to maintain a maintenance of the dividend policy, which states that it will be of 65% of the net profit, or it will be as in the previous year, no dividend, as in 2015-16. So first about CO2, we probably don't know anything more, any crystal ball than anyone else does. So what we can see, the increase, it's a matter of speculation a little bit and some impact, and the approach of the EU, which is in favor of restricting the regulations that will restrict, constrain the supply. So we will probably hardly tell you anything more interesting in terms of the explanations than what is available in the public domain already. As for the cogeneration, after the conclusion of a call and advancement of the work on the development of the entire heat generation segment, we will take another look at the dividend policy in the company. Paweł Kucharski, BZWBK. I have a couple of questions. Let me start with the distribution. Talking about the fact that you were not capable of meeting the regulators' plans due to the catastrophic events, but at the same time you are showing the RAB return at 111%. How can you reconcile? How could you get 101% and be better remunerated if you did not meet the target defined by the regulator? We're talking here about a 2-year delay. So that's a failure to meet the requirements for 2018, which will have an impact on 2019. And here you're talking about the RIB. I think this is the result. So we're just showing this as an illustration that's 101%. These are additional things. We have the data for Q4 2017 as regards the generation based on lignite. We can hear that the modernization will be underway. Is Q4 a good prognostic with regard to lignite-based generation for the next quarters of 2018? Depending on how you approach this. I'm sorry to answer it in this way, but it's definitely not good to multiply the generation by 4, simply to multiply it. If we expect that the prices in the markets around Poland, Sweden, Germany will be lower than in Poland because in Poland CO2 will be high, then probably the situation from Q4, where there was a large import, is not something that could not be expected. That's the first factor. The other are the wind conditions, and whereas probably in Q4 the wind conditions were better than in Q4 in Q4 2017, the wind conditions were better or higher than the average for the past couple of years. If we assume that it will come back to the average amounts, then probably this factor will not be as high, as strong. You should not translate Q4 in a simple way to the whole year, but there are some significant factors that will, with a high degree of probability, they will be maintained. Okay, so Paweł, you took a breath. 101% stems from the implementation of the central system of information exchange. This was one of the elements for the RIB. And I think all the operators are remunerated with this regard. Another question for the wind auctions. It is said that there might be 1,000 megawatts of new power. The question for you is, some time ago you bought large volumes of finalized and unfinalized projects. How much could PGE try to sell at such an auction in terms of onshore wind farms? Probably less than 1,000. Onshore or offshore? Onshore. Onshore. Talking about onshore. The project which is the closest to being completed is the cluster, which is an expansion of the current farms that we have in Pomerania. That's about 80 mega. That's the closest to completion. We will be taking a look at the feasibility of the projects that we have on our portfolio as ones that can be developed, but they're still not operational. The others are less advanced and less feasible. Okay, and the last question for the CEO. Do you believe that a business combination with Energa would be a good solution for PGE? As you will know, we don't comment on press speculations. But I don't want you to comment on press speculations. I'm just asking you about your opinion about a potential other company. If this variant is analyzed, I'm sure I will share this information with you. Thank you very much. Bartek Kubicki. Send down 4 questions, if I may. With distribution, do you have any view from the regulator about how they will treat 2017, where you did not deliver on-site SAIFI? Is there any room for negotiations where those one-offs will not be taken into account? Let me repeat, as always, in an evasive way, we don't comment on the negotiations, be it with ERO or other partners, until concluded. Okay. Also on the distribution about the whole company, the personnel costs increased in Q4. Are these any provisions, any bonuses, any increases? For instance, for distribution, 122% year-on-year in Q4 only. Q4 is the time when various actuarial provisions are recognized. So I'm just trying to reach my head, which is hardly a credible source. It seems that last year we had decreased some provisions, which this year were increased again due to the increase in the discount rate, but it can be changed. As for the pay raises, no, there have been no significant pay raises. Is there any pressure from the employees that everyone is getting an increase by 5–10%, excepting PGE and ourselves? Of course, there are some talks and negotiations. As for the reasonable level of increases to somehow reflect the remuneration increase level in the labor market, but it will not weaken the company in a significant way. But still, these are negotiations which we will not comment on in public, although we always emphasize that any remuneration increases have to be connected with the increases in the company's efficiency. Before you take another breath, the actuarial provision for 2 segments, conventional and OSD generation, was of 71 million, so you would have to make it proportionately to the employees. About Opole and the potential additional delay, would that be able to generate any additional extra capex, or are the possible delays on the cost side of the we don't foresee anything like this. And the last question about the generation margins. First of all, hard coal-based, definitely these margins will drop. If we do the basic arithmetic, the hedge costs, what is behind the decrease of the margins? They were roughly stable over the last 2 years, 30 or so zlotys. This year we can be talking about a 25% decrease. Is this an EA effect or is it anything else? What do you think? We
My też tutaj nad tym się przynajmniej raz w tygodniu
have been given it a thought for at least once a week that this energy price increase, which you could see on the graph, whereas you can still assume that it reflects the increase in the CO2 price, it does not contain both a CO2 increase and the coal price increase at the same time. So these margins on coal, hard coal, are dropping. Whether it's only an effect of Cogeneration, probably not. Another reason that we have no evidence for at this moment is probably the relatively low activity on the demand side. Also for the energy consumers, the very increase is large. We're not fully satisfied that the price, hard coal price is increasing, the CO2 price is growing. I think it's still in effect a psychological effect where not everyone has reconciled with the price increase. Maybe they want to weather it somehow, wait and see. Maybe they have changed into lower, shorter contracting periods. So that's how I would envisage these two elements after the talks to the traders. There must be an impact, a more effective impact of Cogeneration and a psychological effect on the demand side. Piotr, we owe you an answer to your question. But before, now I'm afraid of what you might come up with now. We should know this answer, well, probably from the top of my head, but the contract with the general contractor, 9.4 billion net, and the entire project, we have it on our reports, not to be misled, is 11 billion net, but we have to remember what there is. There's the initial run of $500 million. So we're talking about 13 gross, because this amount of 13 gross, we never heard about it. We always said that it was 9.4. That's the contract with the general contractor. So other than that, there is another 2 billion on top of this for other things. Not 2, 1.6. 1.6, that's a major difference. So that it's 2 billion gross. Okay, thank you very much for this answer. Then I have 2 additional questions. Some time ago, I read in a newspaper about the dissolution of the steering committee of the Polish mining group. Remember when you said and you said you had mechanisms to steer what's going on in this? Now, why was this committee dissolved, and what will you be able to do with 500 million involvement in PGE, and if it doesn't somehow tie up in terms of cash and so on?
Okay.
We obviously have an impact on this through the supervisory board. That's going to be our way, our method of impacting the results of this company. And what did this committee deal with, and what did we lose by liquidating, by getting rid of the committee? I don't think they did anything. Okay. As we are considering the way that the corporate deal governance is done for this, the companies, the supervisory board is to coordinate the board's management board's actions. And who's sitting on the management or the supervisory board on your side? I don't remember the names. We'll check it on the. Let's leave it. And are you aware of what's going on in PGG, what the cash flows are? And I know you cannot comment on this, these are speculations, but we'll be speculating around two centers, Silesia and Lublin. There was such an idea, and now the market took it at the beginning of January that you would buy the whole of PGG or integrate with them vertically. Okay, you're selling some new information to us. Oh, just read it in a newspaper. I'm not coming up with this on my own. I wouldn't have enough imagination if I believed everything that newspapers write about. At any rate, this is new to me. And what's the PGG cash flow this year and next year? Can you say whether this situation, can you get this closer to us, whether are they burning cash or not? Because they're supposed to, they have some paper profit. I think it's best to ask this question of PGG board, but at the beginning of this year it looks optimistic. And one more question about the price, stock price. Do you think the dividend could enhance this rate? And would you suggest any dividend, or do we stick to this no dividend until 2020? We are keeping the stockholders close to our hearts, but we are transforming our company. Please remember, like it or not, the pressure of the EU regulations is so high that we have to transform this company as quickly and as efficiently as possible. I'm asking about this because Energa found some 20 groszy. Are the shareholders happy? Well, it's better this than nothing. Well, I would rather like the shareholders to take a look at PGE on a long-term basis as a champion of Poland's energy market. Okay, thank you very much. About VAT, we are a VAT taxpayer, but we settle it. One more question about offshore. These 12 or 14 billion, are you waiting for an auction, or can this appear at one moment, and will you be doing this irrespective of whether there'll be some auctions and a form of support for this project? And one more question for BREF. There's 1.9 billion zlotys. This is new capex. Is this capex relating to Rybnik? And if so, the question is about Rybnik. It's a relatively old power plant. It should be decommissioned. It should be decommissioned 25 or 6. How much more do you need? Money do you need for this power plant to keep functioning? Do you still think it should be completely disconnected in 20-some year? Or if not, how much capex do you need for it to keep it going? Offshore capex, Emil will tell you more about it. Of course, we assume that offshore farms will appear in the renewables auctions, and we're getting prepared for this. The current reference price at 470 zlotys per megawatt is satisfying for us, given our analyses. I hope this exhausts your question.
To, czy
Our current
nasz
plan
aktualny plan
for Rybnik
dla Rybnika to
is one
element,
element which is heat generation on top of this, and that's what we're planning
jakieś
an additional 100 million to be spent. Another element is BAT in a selective way, not the entire power plant, only those units which we will consider that they will be profitable going forward. And right now we're talking about 100 million zlotys. This is a topic which we will probably also have to discuss with PSE, so
tej liczby jako taka już stała, czy niezmienna.
So I wouldn't treat this figure as stable or unchangeable with regard to BAT and Rybnik. Coming back to our appetite for offshore, onshore farms, irrespective of the auctions, let me remind you of what I said just a moment ago, that an important price-related factor which will impact our decision is the connection cost. It is customary in Europe that the connection costs are incurred by the operator, the TSO. In our case, it's PSE. In this case, it's 1/3 of the expected capex. It is all included in all the tariffs. But if we're talking about capex in our decision, this is an important factor. The negotiations are ahead of us. I hope they will finish as expected by us. Don't hear the question. It's off the mic. Beg your pardon. We're trying to be independent of the other factors, and how Polenergia project will develop, it depends on Polenergia. But you don't contemplate buying this. No comments. I think yesterday or the day before there was information that part of the shares were bought by Statoil in terms of two farms with an option of buying another one. 2 projects. Thank you very much for this lively discussion. I'm very happy about this, contrary to what you might think. So we're closing the conference. We still have some questions sent online. Some they have been largely consumed. Due to time constraints, we have to close the conference right now, and we will answer them throughout the day. Thank you to all the web users and to you, gentlemen, for coming. And ladies are also invited for another session in May. Thank you very much. Goodbye.